Good evening, everybody. I'm praying that all is well with you tonight. It's our Bible study encounter, and we're going to start up in a few minutes. Again, we're a little delayed. I do apologize for that. Prayer has gone forth. Everything is completed there. So now we're just getting ready to prepare ourselves for our Bible study encounter. For those who are new, welcome in. For those who have been with us before, we praise God for you, especially for those on our broadcast, our Periscope, and our Facebook Live community. You are joining us from those areas. We also have those who are in the place with us. God bless you as well. So simply just want to get you all in position, and we're going to go forward in a minute. Just trying to get our Facebook Live folk on. And once we do that, then we will carry on. So we just hope that, like I said, I just hope that you are having a good day, a good afternoon, a good evening. So we are hoping that your experience would be a good one. And we looking forward to the work that you're experiencing on today. So we thank God for you. So we are believing for a victorious day today, and we will probably not have our Facebook Live folks on. There we go. Outstanding. So, again, we are appreciating you. For those who are here, those who are on our different broadcasts, and we thank you for you. Again, I'm going to give it about 2 more minutes, especially for those in our Facebook Live community, to get ready. I know those who are here with us are already prepared and ready. They got the Bibles and notebooks out and they're ready. And I know our Facebook Live community is probably in the same posture. So we're going to go ahead with that as well. And we appreciate you. Again, this is our Bible study encounter tonight. And we are inviting you in on this day. We're inviting you into our Bible study tonight. And we just pray that it will be a blessing to you on this evening. We don't count it robbery that you are joining us. So again, we thank God for you. We appreciate you. We look forward to seeing what God is going to do again in our Bible study community, and for all who are joining us either via live, either via Periscope or Facebook Live and all the other areas. We just thank God for you all in the midst of it, and we just give God praise for you all that you are with us. I am going to be teaching from Ecclesiastes chapter 11. For those who are looking for it, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. I know that's a little off the beaten path for some that are accustomed to me teaching from other areas and arenas, but I'm drawing from Ecclesiastes chapter 11, and we're going to be dealing with the first 5 verses tonight. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, and we're going to be dealing with verses 1 through 5. Again, for those who are either on Facebook Live or Periscope, Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. And we are going to be teaching on that tonight. We thank God for you all. Again, so Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 5 reads as such: Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall be. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Verse 5 says, As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. I want to come to you tonight from simply teaching about, I consider it God's economic plan. I want to call it God's economic plan, and there's a reason why I'm identifying it that, because, well, what is my focus? God, I'm glad you asked. My focus tonight is simply that in this season, we must learn to be more charitable by spreading the wealth that we have instead of trying to hoard it or keep it to ourselves. I'm not here to tell you how to spend your money. That's not what I'm doing. I'm here to give you an opportunity to really understand a little bit better about how more beneficial it is when we step out on faith and do anything, whether it be starting a new venture, whether it be planting a seed in someone's life, whether it means giving in an area that someone asked you to give and you've hesitated for it. This is that time where we must realize it, because let me say this, what we tend to do is we tend to hesitate when it comes down to opportunities that come around that would benefit us or actually help someone else, and we would get something out of a blessing from it. We're venturing in. Next week is Thanksgiving, and that will be the beginning of what we call a season of giving, where it's Thanksgiving and Christmas, where people are going to be venturing out on Black Friday and so many different areas, buying all of these gifts and presents for people. For some, it's a very pleasant time. For others, it's a very stressful time. But no matter how you look at it, it is a season of giving, a season of opportunities for them. And what we're going to be looking at tonight is about getting that understanding that what is actually happening is a heart change goes on when it comes down to how we give. So Ecclesiastes, written the wisdom of Solomon, we see, who, again, we know is a great writer of wisdom. In this particular chapter, he continues on this discourse that he started in chapter 9. And it's pertaining to the will of man and how we should respond to the challenges of life. What Solomon had done here, we know he wrote Proverbs. We know he's very eloquent in how he expresses things. But through everything he's been doing, he did a lot of writing of doom and gloom. But in chapter 9 through chapter 11, actually through chapter 12, he begins to speak about the ethics of life, how we should function ethically, how we should walk in the ethics of our life. Not morality per se, but the ethics, that teaching, that foundation that we should realize, what we define to be ethical. He started getting into a very deep expounding on that, a great description of it, an explanation. And in this chapter of Ecclesiastes, he begins to start speaking about what is ethical when it comes down to how we perceive giving, or how we perceive opportunities that have presented themselves before us. So he's not actually talking about the ethics of mankind, but he's really here speaking more about the ethics of the individual man. Now, I know some would say that's the same thing, but actually it's not, because if we're if we're speaking about the ethics of mankind, what we're trying to do is give a broad brush against the entire world of people, humankind, humanity in itself, and saying all should function in these ethics, which now restricts people from making any real cognitive decisions about what they should do and how they should live. But when what Solomon is speaking of here in this chapter is about the ethics of man, the ethics of the individual, and how you can take these particular diatribe that he's sharing here to expound on. You can even implement them in your life. I like to call them standards. I like to call them those foundational principles that we put in place for ourselves so that we can live effectively within a realm that is comfortable for us, keeps us within the borders of respect, morality, integrity, but also limits us from engaging in those that may not participate or believe or embrace as we are, but are disrespectful of it. Not those that honor and respect it, because you want to engage those that, even though they don't agree with you, they still respect that you have a particular opinion. You will always have open communication, but you will find those who do not agree, do not like anything that is said, it's not very appreciative of what you do or how you function, and will be very, I would say, confrontational. But Solomon speaking here is about what is ethical in his understanding. And now, again, we know Solomon has great wisdom. He was gifted of that. So this is his determination of what is ethical. So again, we see in the chapter 9 how he gives us certain things that we should describe or elaborate our lives on pertaining to life and death. He goes into chapter 10 on the defense of his ethics. He's trying to give us some of those certain things that we may have to deal with in the perils of our lives. So, such as prudence and pessimism, suspicion, responsibility, kindness. These are the things that he's applying now, ethical recourse on, ethical standards on, ethical issues on. He's addressing those things. But as he moves into chapter 11, now he's speaking upon certain elements that are not only ethical, but it's just basic common sense, and trying to explain and elaborate on a better understanding on what would be beneficial for us when it comes down to giving, but not only on what we give, on how we give, on why we give. Now, this is not talking about tithe and offerings. This is not talking about those things. It's talking about being charitable in any aspect of your life, but understanding it's about seed time and harvest. It's about planting. It's about harvesting. It's about sowing and about reaping, but from a better understanding as to why things happen in particular times. Listen, here's the amazing thing: as a pastor in the kingdom, a leader in the church, we do find it's always difficult to try to help people or encourage people to give, even when they don't deem that it's appropriate or timely for them to give. They find struggle in it, they find reason or rationale not to do that. And it does become very struggling and difficult for those leaders to want to encourage people to give, not for the benefit of those that are receiving, but for the benefit of just knowing that you gave in the willingness. We saw this 2 weeks ago when at the end of the day, people may have been discouraged, but anyone that can walk out of the room and said, no matter the result, I voted. There's a level of confidence there, a level of peace about knowing that even though it didn't go the way I decided it to go or wanted it to go, I voted, I contributed, I gave. And the same thing that's happening here is what Solomon is trying to initiate in the understanding that people are having here about how we should go about helping those who are less fortunate. And again, it's not just about sowing into people, but helping people who are less fortunate. So again, in chapter 11 of this, again, for those who are just joining us, we welcome you. We are in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. In this chapter, the author gives us advice simply on how to live while recognizing the limitations of our human wisdom and knowledge. Here's the thing. We will change how we function and how we respond to things based on the conditions of the environment that we live. We will change how we do things. How do we notice? Within the last 14 days or so, and I can be real about it, people have gone from being very hopeful and joyful in life to now being in this place of doom and destruction, a level of such great fear in their lives that is literally stunned some people and disabled others. But the question I had about that is how do we function beyond the changing of our conditions and circumstances? Do we stop living because we deem that what's coming is going to end life? Or do we keep living with the belief that God is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega? How can we apply our faith to guide us through these processes where the environmental conditions are determining something that we may not be comfortable with or we may not be able to identify with? How can we move beyond what has occurred in order for us to still have a hope that we obtained in the years before then, and carrying into the situation where we may define to be hopeless? How can we still walk in our process and continue doing what we're doing, even if we believe or we seeing that a storm is coming? Do we stop living because there's a storm coming, or do we keep pressing towards what God called us to do in order to obtain what God has established for us? How do we set that foundation and that differencing there? And God led me to this chapter of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon is simply talking about how we live beyond the circumstances, and we don't actually allow the conditions to determine how we live or what we do in our living. Again, we interpret these things. At the end of the day, we think about this. Let's go back to the basic foundation of it. I've heard people say, well, I got to get myself together before I come to church. No, you come to church to get yourself together. Or they say, well, I want to plant a seed, but I got to make sure my finances are where I need them to be so I can sow. No, you want to sow in that situation so that your finances could line up to where you are. So these are different things that they're saying. Now this one blew my mind. I actually heard someone say, well, I'm going to start going to the gym once I start getting healthy. No, you go to the gym to get healthy. So, people have this misnomer about how it works, and a complete lack of understanding on how it should function, because we don't want to go in these places. We don't want to do these things because the things that we need to do to get where we want to be, we actually put behind them. It's literally saying that we're going to take the horses, put them behind the cart, and we're going to pull the cart. When at the end of the day, the horses were there to move the cart so that you don't have to work as hard. So if we're going to sit here and do that, then we're missing the full process. Solomon, in his understanding here in Ecclesiastes, speaks highly to this. He speaks about it in a very clear way. First thing he says in the first verse of chapter 11 of Ecclesiastes, he says, cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again. There's certain things that he says here. Now I can literally go into breaking this down on a very theological perspective, but I want to break it down in a different manner. I want to look at it from two different statements within one verse. The first thing he says, cast your bread upon the waters. If you really understand the history of what has occurred when it comes down to casting of bread, you will realize that what he is stipulating here is that something that would happen historically during the times in which it was written. Mind you, they were ones that were used to be enslaved in Egypt, and they've moved from that posture. But the learning, the teachings of the Egyptians, and the fact that the River Nile was very close in proximity to where they are, Solomon had the wisdom to actually witness how things occurred. And one thing that he realized at that time was that what would happen is that certain things would happen where farmers or even fishermen, as they got close to the shore, there's this marshland. The marshland is that area between the deepness of the water and the land itself, where the water and the land is blended to a point where it's very muddy. There is growth there, weeds and of such growing in that particular area. So there is a place for growth, but because it's so saturated with the water, anything that is known to be put in there, if it's not the proper seed, will basically be considered drowned and not useful. But what these leaders and farmers would do was they would cast their seed on this marshland into this water, and then they would take their animals, their cows and things, and they would have them walk upon the ground and walk in that water area, that marshland, where they toss the seed, and that would actually push the seed, the wet seed, into the ground. And what is happening at that moment is the seed is not only being planted in the ground, but it's being watered at the same process, something that is very rarely done. Oftentimes we hear, as Paul writes, one plants, another waters. But in this particular process, what happens is the watering and the planting is occurring at the exact same time. So why is this important? It's important because a few days after that, as the waters have receded, has receded and the ground has now become dry, if it is proper seed, you should see something growing up. You should see some things popping up from that, simply because there's no need for a third party there. You've done it all in one particular process. So when they're saying, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days, it's simply saying that anything that you planted in that time, if you wait a few days, you will see where it ended, where it landed, because the results of your planting should be something coming up. My God, let me say it again. The results of your planting should be seeing something come up. So again, the first thing that Solomon is indicating here is that anything you put in the ground, whether it be dry ground, whether it be moist ground, whether it be marshland, when you put it there, you may not know where it landed, but by faith, you will see in a few days what has become of what you've planted. But you never understand that if you don't take the effort to plant. Just because it looks like there's too much water or too much of something doesn't mean that there is no possibility for growth. Just because you're oversaturated or drowning in a situation doesn't mean that's not a place that you cannot grow from. Doesn't mean that you cannot produce something. It doesn't mean that there will be nothing producing from it. You may find yourself in a place that is of optimal conditions and works for you. But if you find yourself in a situation where it's like you can't even keep your head above water, doesn't mean that there is doom in front of you. It just means that that is a possibility for growth. If you find yourself to a point, let me say it this way. If you find yourself at a point where you feel like you're so close to the fact that the water rising above your head, you better plant a seed. Because when that water resides, when that water starts reducing, when that water starts evaporating away, and you start finding yourself standing on a more solid and firm foundation, you should be giving God praise if you can look around and find there's vegetation growing where there was no vegetation before. Because the only way anything could have grown and produced in that situation is because in the midst of your circumstances where you were overwhelmed by the conditions, you still had the wherewithal and the fortitude to plant a seed. In the midst of you going through a struggle in that time, you still had the energy and the desire to plant something when you didn't think that anything could be produced. It's not about the result. It's about the effort. It's not about seeing something come up in your difficult time. You must realize that when you are going through that struggle, that's one of the best times for you to plant something. I people all the time that the best of things can end up popping up in the worst of conditions. So when you find yourself in the worst of conditions, doesn't always mean that that is an inability for anything to be produced. In fact, when you find yourself in the worst of conditions, that's where the tendency for the best of things to be produced. You just have to be willing. When you find yourself close enough to the shore, but not on solid ground just yet, you start throwing seed between you and what is safe, you and what is firm, what you call firm foundation, and just see what is produced from that process. That's what I find great about the wisdom of Solomon, because Solomon was perceiving that you don't have to be on solid ground to plant a seed. You don't always have to have a solid foundation under you for you to plant a seed to help you to produce in it. Sometimes your foundation gets shaky. Sometimes your foundation gets muddy. Sometimes your foundation gets flooded and inundated with a lot of negative things, difficulties, and challenges. But it doesn't mean you don't have foundation. It just means something is affecting the foundation. But in the midst of that, you want to do something that very few do. In the midst of that challenge, you want to plant something in that seed. So when those troubles wash away, I love the song that says trouble doesn't last always. When those troubles are gone, you should be able to have something that's going to produce in your life after the fact. Not instead of trying to wait until the good situation, you just need to start planting when it's just too rough to see the planting. So again, Solomon is expressing one thought here, to take a calculated and wise step forward in life, like a farmer who throws a seed on the wet and marshy ground and waits for it to grow. He's saying, how much of a risk are you willing to take when the situations are not at their best? How much of a risk are you willing to take when everything doesn't look like it's going to produce anything? How much of a risk are you willing to step forward and put out in the midst of your journey when it seems like what you're going through is not setting you up for the best of life? Because if you can recognize, even in the hardest places, that there is still an opportunity for growth, still an opportunity to produce, still an opportunity to be blessed by it, then you would still keep planting even when the struggle is too real. So, since it is difficult to know what will be profitable and what will fall victim to the time and circumstances, people should work hard in multiple areas. So, there's two different determinations that Solomon is speaking of, even in this simple first verse. He's not only talking about spreading, this casting the seed upon the waters, for you'll find it in many days. He's speaking about seed time and harvest. But also, he's speaking about the proper way of investing in the lives of the people around you. Now, oftentimes what we try to do is we try to be the determiner of how and where our funding, our finances, our money should go. We will ask 50 million questions before we give to someone. We become very distrusting of anyone. We become very suspicious of those. And then we want financial recordation of every dime and every penny that goes forth, because we want to make sure that it goes where we want it to go. But when our heartstrings are pulled because of a tragedy, a natural disaster of some sort, we're not considering all of the little intricacies about it. We just want to know, where can we plant that seed? When it comes down to really planting in the lives of people, we have to actually reduce and minimalize just how much more information we need. What am I talking about? Meaning, what do we need? We have to stop trying to be so definitive about where our seed goes, to the point where we will reject people when it comes down to them needing something from us. Again, scatter means you don't actually know where it's going. You just know that it's spread. Scattering doesn't mean that you can determine where every seed is planted. It's just scattered. And wherever it lands, there's an expectation of growth from where it landed. But if you have to know exactly where every seed goes, you will be planting for a very long time, because you'll be trying to measure what the best seed goes in what portion of the soil at what particular time, and you're adding too many steps to a process where God is telling us to plant and then reap. So we spread our seed around so that we can be generous to those who need the harvest. So again, the first verse says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it in many days. We understand that's the desire to plant, and knowing that when you cast that seed, you may not be certain where it goes, but you are sure that if you plant it, that something has to be produced from it. You may plant 15 seeds and only produce from 8 or 9 of them, but some 8 or 9 of them may produce a double portion. So it doesn't matter how many produce, long as something is produced. So Solomon says this in the first verse. But he goes into the second verse and says, give a serving to 7 and also to 8. For you do not know what evil will be on the earth. What is he indicating here? He's saying here, he's again alluding to a custom where if someone had a meal and had invited guests, the one that would invite them to the meal would distribute the food, several portions, to the guests. So if you had 7 guests there, he would divide out evenly 7 portions to those guests. But he would also make sure there was an 8th portion, and the 8th portion was always given to the poor. So if he had enough for everyone, he always set aside for the less fortunate. Even if they were not there for the meal, they always set aside. The scripture even tells us that when you harvest a field, You don't harvest the 10th portion, the 10% on the outskirts of the field, because that is left for the poor. So what we must realize is that God has always established and set us up to only be living and functioning off of 90% of what we do and not 100%, even though we're growing and planting 100%. But we must realize there's a major difference there. And if we don't do it the right way and try to live off 100%, then we will miss the blessing God has given unto us. So we see, even he says, divide. A different interpretation says, divide what you have into 7 parts, or even into 8, because you don't know what disaster may happen on the earth. So again, we talked about in the first verse, there's 2 different determinations here. One about how giving properly, and one about investing properly to make sure that you have a rainy day fund in that aspect. But also what is being spoken here is he's saying that we should never leave the poor out. Because one thing I'm quite certain on, and I believe that Solomon was implying here, is that the more people that you help out, even in your better days, are more people that will help you out if your days don't go as well. Let me say it again. My God, I love this. This just kicked me right in the gut. When you start planning in people's lives, not with the expectation they're going to hook you up in your situation, but you just do it because you have the heart to help. When you find yourself in a struggle, they'll remember you and say, I remember the day that they helped me when I had my struggle, and now they're struggling, I must help them. It is reciprocated as cyclical, because no matter how you plan in someone else's life, they will always remember what you've done for them. And if they're able to help you in those situations, by right, they will. But you don't do this with the intent of that happening. You just still give because you can. So what Solomon is implying here, he's saying, give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will bring on the earth. He's not just speaking about giving. Again, he's speaking about investing. But we also talking about when you couple it to the first verse, that you'll realize that it speaks more of the generosity of the giver, and yet considers the giving an investment in their future, and the future, the one they're giving it. Here's the beautiful thing about this, and that's why I love the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon is simply saying here, when you find yourself in a place and you start just spreading the wealth and just sharing and sowing seed into the lives of the people around you, not only are you investing in your future by planting a seed and expecting a harvest, but you're helping those who didn't think they had a future now have one. Okay, let me say it again. You're helping those who didn't think they had a future now have one. Why? Because if you're planting a seed in someone's life that is in an extreme lack, struggle, or difficulty in their situation, and yet you just planted a seed in their life, what you are now doing is giving them a hope of a future that they might not have had before they met you. So your seed planted is not only in fertile soil in the fields that you are already managing, which God has given you, but now you're planting seed in fields that others occupy, others dwell, others live in, and now you are not only just helping your harvest to grow, but you're helping theirs as well. Did not Christ say, one plants, another reaps? He told them these fields are ripe for harvest. So what he's saying is that someone thought enough about your destiny and your future to plant seed in fields that are going to be a part of your journey, that you're going to come across at an optimal time in your life, but only if you walk and continue to walk through that journey in order to encounter those fields. But in the process of you encountering fields that people have set up and prepared for you, you should still be planting on your way. So even though the struggle is real in your life, if you can find the way to help someone else, even in your struggle, you never know who you're helping, and you never know how they may help you at the end of the day. So what is happening here? Solomon is implying that we must be generous while there is plenty, and make friends while time remains, because one never knows when he might need them to return the favor. Never cease giving while you see a person in distress, and even when it seems you giving is complete. So let me say it again. Never cease giving while you see a person in distress, even when it seems that your giving is complete. Let's go back to the symbolism of what's happening here. Solomon says, give a serving to 7. We understand that 7 is completion, fulfillment, perfection. So he's saying, give until it's complete. And then he says, also to 8, which is now new beginnings. What if you look at it from a prophetic interpretation, then what you will recognize here is that what Solomon is saying here is that after you've completed doing the work in your own life, when you plant a seed in someone else's, you're giving them a new opportunity. You're giving them a new beginning. You're giving them a new chance that they didn't have. But you have to continue doing the work in your own life. So you keep completing the task in your life. And then that last portion that you give is a new portion to someone else. My God. Let me look at what he says. That last portion you give is a new portion to someone else. You may be finished in your well-doing in that moment, but the last step that you give is a new step for someone else. So it's literally carrying the baton and handing it off to someone and saying, look, this is what I have left, and I'm giving it to you so you can carry on. Did not the apostles say, silver and gold I do not have, but what I have I give unto you? And what he actually gave him was new life. He didn't give him any finances. He didn't give him any house or cars. He gave him new life, new opportunity, new building. He healed him so that he could start life again. You have to learn to give to people to a point where what you're giving them will give them a new chance and a new direction, something new in their life. And that means that you can't just consider what they need based on your determination or based on your measurement of what is needed by them. You must continue to be faithful about that and move into that process, because what God has set up is done in that way. So again, never cease giving while you see a person in distress, even when it seems your giving is complete. But when you give beyond the completion, you are giving that person another chance, which is new. So our work is never finished. For with each seed that we sow, we are giving another chance, another new opportunity to someone else. Someone is going to eat from that field that you plant in. Someone is going to reap that harvest that you put in, and you may never meet them. You will never encounter them, but you will know that it is something that they receive. So I'm saying all this because as we're going into the 3rd verse, Solomon gives us one indicator. He clearly tells us that we should not consider who is receiving the gift if our purpose is to give. Let me say it again. We should not consider who is receiving the gift if our purpose is to give. Now, I'm not telling you to just go out giving unknowingly or blindly, giving to a point where no comprehension. Again, scatter means scatter. But when he says scatter, he's scattering into a particular field. So if you have an intent to plant in that field, you're scattering into that field. You don't scatter into the drain. You don't scatter onto the road. You're scattering into that field. So although there are some stipulations on where you're sowing, there's not so specific that you rescind your seed from giving it to people that gracefully need it. Look at verse 3. He says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in that place where the trees fall, there it shall be. Again, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in that place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. There's 2 things that he's speaking about here. He's talking about rain. He's talking about a tree. But what he's speaking here is very clear. Hey, Solomon is implying in this verse that the world is full of things over which we, mankind, has no control, including the purposes of God. For example, the first thing he says is that a cloud cannot control. First thing he says, if a clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. The clouds cannot determine where that rain goes. The cloud, in other words, if the cloud has a destiny or a destined point of saying, I'm gonna drop my rain over Colorado, but yet it's but yet it's full of rain over Florida, and it can't go any further until it releases the rain. Guess what's going to happen? He's going to release the rain. It's not up to him. Why? Because where God determines for that rain to go, it's where that rain shall go. Once the cloud starts trying to determine where the rain goes, then the cloud is no longer walking in the purpose God has for him. Because the true purpose of that cloud is this: to produce rain and then release it. Not to say, well, I need to measure where it goes. I want the precipitation to go in this area or that area. No, the cloud's responsibility is to store up rain. And when it has acquired enough rain, then it must be released so it can store up more rain. Because anytime you get to a point where your purpose is hindered because you have not released or you're storing up, that is preventing you from doing what you must do, then it is a problem. The cloud's responsibility, watch this, the cloud's responsibility is to store rain, to store water. So when it stores water and its storage is full, it must empty so it can go back to doing its purpose once again. So whoever receives the rain at that time is receiving it at the distinct time that God determines it to be, because God measures out how long and how much that cloud can take before it must release it. So no matter how you look at it, everyone has a breaking point. You can take, now, as a kid, we used to throw water balloons. We all did it. But if you go get a balloon and you fill it up with water, there is a point where the balloon cannot retain any more water and it will burst. Why? Because it is the breaking point of that balloon. We have to stop living on the breaking point of our lives and learn to start measuring out. It says, with what measure you give, so you shall receive. Good measure, pressed down, shaking up, running over into your lap. We have to learn how to measure out and know when God says to release, because he wants us to walk in the overflow. But the overflow doesn't mean that we are restricting ourselves or being stingy and stringent about what we're giving. The overflow means that we're continually pouring out in others. And because we're pouring out in the others are pouring into us, where we are now forced to continue to pour out into others so we can make room for what's coming in. That's what overflow is. Overflow is not, well, God is pouring into me, pouring into me, pouring into me, pouring into me, and I'm not going to release any of it into anyone else, because if I release it into anyone else, then I'm not receiving anything back. Overflow means, God, whatever you pouring into me, I'm going to continue to pour out. Think about this. A pitcher by any understanding has a place where you pour into and a place where you pour out. If you fill that pitcher high enough, it's going to automatically pour out. So when you start realizing what the overflow is never how much you can retain, it's how much you can contain. And that means how much you can keep putting out to others, because as a container, you have a limited amount that you can receive. But if you continue to keep it topped off, it is not because you're trying to hold from others, it's because you're pouring into others. That's why he says here in verse 2, where once you give 7, give 8. Because it's a matter of, if you keep giving beyond where you are to give, that 8 is going to be pouring back into you. So if you have poured out 7, which is the limitation for, if you are a container, watch this, if you are a container that holds 7 cups, but yet you pour out 8, the 8th has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? That is a continual pouring into you. So you shall never run empty. You shall never run dry. You should always be full, because if you are pouring out 7 and then it says pour out 8, it's because as you are finalizing that 7, there's still being poured into you, which means there's a cup left over. That's why the cup is running over, because it's never empty and it's never dry. And the reason is because we have learned to scatter our seed and been expecting a harvest in everything we plant. So it must be a continuation of how you are pouring out in order for people to pour in. We should not be focusing on what's being poured into us. We should be more focused on how we pour out, not who we pour out, but how we pour out, meaning that we are constantly pouring out into the lives of the people around us with the faith to know that where we're pouring is going to eventually pour back into us. And now it is a continuation of life, a cycle of life, and we are seed time and harvest at the exact same time, instead of being seed time being one moment, harvest time being another, but seed time and harvest being the exact same thing and a continuation in your life. So, see, Solomon realizes that with giving indiscriminately, there will be some who receive that are not in need, or as some describe, do not need it. This is when it comes down to scattering the seed. Because what Solomon is saying in verse 3, again, he says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, that's where it shall lie. What he is saying in these verses is simply this, that we cannot determine who finishes, we cannot determine who receives. But what we can determine is that we're going to give. We cannot determine every person is the appropriate one. You can plant a seed in someone's life and down the line find out that they really didn't deserve it. But at the end of the day, who decides or who determined that they really deserved it? How do you know that your seed went into someone that didn't deserve it? Because it's still your seed was still planted in a field, and it still should produce a harvest. You may not like that they received it, but they received it for a reason. So he says that a cloud full of water will eventually release his rain. But it also says where a tree falls to the south or the north, and that place where a tree falls, that where it shall be. The tree doesn't determine where it's going to fall. The tree just knows it's going to fall. So what happens is you can't determine what's going to happen. You just have to embrace that it will. Let me say it again. You can't determine what's going to happen. You just have to embrace that it will. If you do your assignment, as I shared with the cloud, if you trust in God and do what he's asked of you to do, then the determination from that will be fulfilled and the assignment will be complete. But if you keep trying to measure it out based on what you identify it to be, then what will happen is you're missing the true assignment of God and the true measurement of what God is asking of you, and then therefore you're lacking the full comprehension, and then there's no response. Now it's a negative and you're missing it because you're going to miss a field because you didn't deem that the field, you either felt that the field didn't need your seed, or you felt like the field would do wrong with your seed. But you don't know what the seed's going to do. You just have to plant it. So again, we should try not to discriminate in our giving based on our determination of need. We should give in spite of and have faith that it is being sown into good, fertile ground. Because see, Solomon is speaking of faith. Amen. Amen. Food for the soul. Amen. God is speaking of faith. Faith is a development of events beyond a person's control, regarded as determined by a supernatural power. You don't know what's going to happen with the seed. Your only responsibility is to plant it. Let me say it again. You don't know what's going to happen with the seed. Your only responsibility is to plant it. But the beautiful thing is, and I want to throw this in there, is there will be times where God will put you in such a situation where the seed that you're planting will be watered as you're planting it. Oh, God. There will be times that if you are willing to scatter the seed, God will saturate it as you're scattering it. That is the ultimate blessing in God, because at that point, you don't have to wait for someone to come along and water it. As Paul says, one plants, another waters. But when you find yourself planting in the marshland, it's already being saturated as it's being planted. And that means that he literally skips a step because he incorporates the two steps into one. So now your harvest will come more quicker, less time, because you don't have to wait for someone else to fulfill their assignment, which is to water what you've already planted. Because God says, I'll water it for you. And that's where you have, that's what Solomon is speaking about in this passage, where he's saying that when you are willing to really give that seed out and plant it out in the proper way, then the saturation will come forth and you will receive from it the blessings of God from it, because in the mindset is you don't have to look for someone else to come in agreement with you. You just simply plant what you know to plant. No one has to like what you're doing. No one has to be in agreement with it. People can get angry about it. People can be upset about it. But if you plant that seed when God tells you to, don't be surprised if you see something pop up when the water resides. Don't be surprised when you see a harvest waiting for you when the water dissipates. Because what God has called you to do, God has established for you to grow. And that's the key to it. So again, that's why there is no reason. So there is no reason to wait for the best conditions to do the work. Let me say this. We've been talking about the proper seeding and just understanding that this is God's plan, this is God's process, and what God is doing, we can't determine, we can't define it in any way. We just have to trust him. But I want to say this to you, because verse 4 speaks directly to this. There is no reason to wait for the best of conditions to do a good work. We need to stop waiting. We need to stop waiting for the best situation in order for us to plant a seed. In other words, I've watched people get to the biggest conventions and conferences and convocations, and they'll plant their seed there. But they will not plant their seed in the small corner store church because they don't believe that if they plant there that they're going to reap the same kind of bountiful harvest. We need to stop measuring where we plant because we don't see the definitive of where it plants. We just want to go where we want to go. Listen, verse 4 says, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the cloud will not reap. I taught a little bit about this earlier today in the broadcast, but on here I want to share this. Solomon's response here is that the reason for our lack of success is not on the conditions, but on the response to them. Okay, he's saying right here, it's not about the conditions themselves. It's about how we respond to the conditions. Okay, let me clarify. It's about how we respond to the conditions. And for example, we so often focus on waiting for the best conditions and circumstances to occur before we begin to work. In other words, say, okay, well, we're going to have a cookout, but we're not going to have it if it starts raining. Why? Because what is it going to stop? Because one thing I understand is the grill is covered, so the food will still cook even if it's raining. So the thing about it is just because the conditions are not the best doesn't mean that you can't go forward with the process. Anything that is delayed by unforeseen conditions is a work that has not begun. Let me say it again. Anything that is delayed by unforeseen conditions is simply a work that has not begun, and watch this, probably will not begin. Why? Because what we're doing in this process, as he says, is we're so focused on what's going on around us that it literally prevents us from doing what we're supposed to do. So if God has called you to plant a seed, you can't wait for the conditions to be the most optimal for you to plant the seed. You have to plant the seed because God told you to plant. Even if there's a storm out, if God told you to plant. Think about it. When Peter was called out of the boat by Christ, it was not sunshine and bright day and calm winds. It was a storm to a point where they could not see one another. But Peter said, Lord, if it's you, just bid me to come and I will. He said, come. And he stepped out of the boat into the storm-raged sea, walked upon it, but it wasn't until he recognized the circumstances around him and relieving that he didn't belong there that he began to sink. If God called you to do something, it doesn't matter if it's in the middle of a storm or in the middle of rainbow, bright, sunshiny day. When God called you to do it, you should do it in spite of. Oh, I would tell people right now, in spite of. You know, you tell your neighbor in spite of. Because what we do is we do things based on our determination and our measurement of time instead of really recognizing that what it is that we're supposed to be doing should be done in spite of. So, taking time, watch this, to try to determine the future of what's going to happen, what we think going to happen, accomplishes nothing. Let me say it again. Taking time to try to determine the future accomplishes nothing. Let me say it last time. Taking time to try to determine the future accomplishes nothing. Because since no one can know the future, it is better to just simply do the work. Solomon is saying here that we got to stop looking at everything else and start focusing on what we're supposed to do. I have seen destinies limited. I've seen destinies delayed. I've seen visions and purpose held up because they kept saying we don't have this and we don't have that. Listen, we're going through a building fund campaign right now. We get frustrated because there's things we want to do because we don't have the money to do it. But we're not stopping. Watch this. We may not have all the money to do it. Doesn't mean that we're stopping. We're looking at alternatives to make it happen. Oh, come on. Let me say it again. Just because it's not working out for the way we plan it doesn't mean that we're going to just stop doing it. We just look for alternatives to make it happen. So unforeseen, I love this. It's a quote. Unforeseen events come from God. And the man who is always gazing on the uncertain future will neither begin nor complete any useful work. Again, unforeseen events come from God. Therefore, the man who always gazing on the uncertain future will neither begin nor complete any useful work. If you keep looking for the bright sunshiny day before you get something done, you're going to miss it. If you keep looking at and keep hoping for the best of circumstances before you make it happen, you're going to miss it. If you keep looking at the determination of what is right and what isn't right, you'll never accomplish what is set before you. Because what you're looking at is what the optimal situation and circumstances are without any clear definitive of what it should be. But if you're trusting in God and being of good courage, then what you will realize that what God has established for you is going to happen no matter the situation, no matter the circumstances. Therefore, we must not allow our desire for the proper conditions to delay the work. There is no perfect situation. There is no perfect outcome. There's no perfect circumstances. Again, there's no perfect situation. There's no perfect outcome. There's no perfect circumstances. And if we keep looking for those things before we start moving into doing anything, then all we're going to do is hold up, limit, or end up not doing what God called us to do. So we need to stop waiting. We need to get up and go and do what we have to do. I was even sharing with them on Sunday as God was telling the prophet Samuel, why are you delaying? Why are you delaying? Stop mourning and go and do what you have to do. So there's a difference between it. We need to stop waiting on the plans of God, waiting for the conditions to line up with the plans of God and fulfill the plans of God in spite of the conditions. So again, we need to stop waiting on the conditions to line up with the plans of God and fulfill the plans of God in spite of the conditions. Because you may not realize that God could very well have you doing these things in those conditions and set the conditions up to see if you're willing to do them when everything is not optimal. So what am I saying to you? We must not allow our desire for the proper conditions to delay the work. Watch this. The farmer that delays planting until the winds change is one who may miss the window of opportunity. And also the farmer who waits for the sky to clear up is one who may end up harvesting his crops beyond the moment of ripeness. God sets things up in a measurement of time where you can miss that opportunity if you put things in place and delay it. If you sit back and you wait too long to pull your harvest, then what happens is you're reducing the amount of time that harvest will be viable in your life. I love fruit, and I love all different kinds of fruit. And the one thing is, when I go to the store and I purchase bananas, I like to purchase bananas that are not completely green, but not completely yellow as well. Why? Because I want them to last. So if I get them fairly green, I know I have longer time for them. And when I bring them home, it gives me time for them to ripen. And when I'm ready for them is at the moment when their ripeness has occurred. So I learn to determine how long it's going to take for them to be ripe in the proper conditions. And I start choosing those things in that situation. When you want to plant seed for God, you have to start looking at yourself and saying, okay, even though the conditions aren't appropriate, if I plant now, I know the harvest is going to be real. So I need to start planting in an appropriate way instead of saying, okay, it's not the right time. It is always the right time to plant for God. Let me say it again. It is always the right time to plant for God. So I'm saying this, stop waiting for a better season. Let me say it again. Let me say it again. Stop waiting for a better season. We need to stop waiting. We need to stop waiting for our season to be so optimal and so perfect that we are not doing what we're supposed to do. Stop waiting for a better season. Waiting to plant will cause you to miss the opportunity to plant. Excuse me. Again, waiting to plant will cause you to miss an opportunity to plant. Waiting gives rise for chance for calamity or spoilage and disaster to reach your unplanted seed. When you wait to plant, okay, let me say it this way. When you wait to plant, what happens is You miss that window of opportunity of nature that defines the best time for you to plant. If you know you need that seed to produce a harvest by a particular time, and you don't plant when you're supposed to measure to make sure that it grows at a particular time, then you are delaying the harvest. You can't delay the harvest because you look out the window and you realize, oh, okay, it's too cold for me to go out. Oh, it's rainy today. Oh, it's too dry. You don't matter the conditions. If you know that seed has to go in the ground at that time, that seed needs to go in the ground no matter what. If you know that you have to plant in that time in order for that harvest to arrive when it's supposed to arrive, you just need to plant in spite of. But the longer that you wait, the longer that you hold, the longer that you delay, the worse that it shall become. So waiting gives rise to chances for spoilage and destruction to reach your unplanted seed. Because here's the thing, if you got seed sitting in a storeroom and you didn't plant it in time, it could get spoiled, but also something or animals could come along and consume it. So you don't want to do it either way. Not only will you lose the seed, but you will also lose the potential of what it could produce. The one thing I know about seed is some seed has double seed in it. So you may get double the harvest from the seed, but if you don't plant it at all, you get nothing. So double of nothing is nothing. So you never know what's going to be planted in that seed if you don't take the effort to plant the seed in the first place. Don't stop your process because you're not willing to plant. Again, also, delaying your harvest until the conditions change will also destroy your harvest. Delaying your harvesting until the conditions change. So you look out and you say, "Oh, there's a storm coming, so I won't harvest. I'll wait." Or this, that, and the other. I'll wait. No. You got to harvest when it's ripe, no matter the conditions. Why? Because when you harvest on time, you are harvesting at the best optimal position for that harvest, and at the time when it is needed, not only for you but for those that are awaiting what you have in the ground. So if you delay it, you run the risk of that being spoiled, or that being destroyed, or the storms coming and destroying it. I used to read stories and watch movies about farmers who know that a hurricane or a tornado was coming, and they rushed to harvest their crops because they knew the tornado would destroy their crops, and they knew that if they didn't have it stored up beforehand, they would lose it after the fact. You got to realize the storm is not something you wait out. The storm is something that's coming to tell you if you don't hurry up, you're going to lose it. So you need to make sure that you harvest when it's there before the storm arrives. Amen, somebody. So the reality is that when you're walking in that harvesting, you're walking in that process, it's about the expectation. So if nothing is done till after all difficulties are removed, then no good thing would ever be done. If nothing is done until all difficulties are removed, no good thing will ever be done. There are some seed that cannot wait for a better season to be planted. Again, there is some seed that just simply cannot wait for a better seed to be planted. It has to be planted when the timing is correct and the timing is right. So if you miss that timing, you miss that planting. And you can't wait another season for it to happen. That seed was for that season. So there are some harvests that cannot wait for the storms to pass in order to be harvested. We have to stop waiting for the conditions to be the best in order for us to expect the best from God. God's best works in all conditions. God's best works in all circumstances. God's best works in all situations. So it's never about never about waiting on God's best for it to happen. God's best is already in place. So it is understood that the best results can occur in the worst of conditions. So you cannot wait until your finances are in proper order, or your health is optimal, or your family is working in solidarity before you start planting. Some things need your seed to be planted on your crops, harvested in order for them to be resolved. The one thing is we gotta stop waiting for everything to be in the right position in order for us to do it. We simply just need to go ahead and do it in spite of. Because again, you may never realize that the seed that you plant during that situation will very well be that harvest that you need to get out of that situation. So that's the greatness of it. Plant even when the times of struggle or the times are challenging or the conditions don't seem optimal. Say we don't have the money for it. You always have the money to try to change your situation. You always have the money. You know, the beautiful thing is, they always said if you have lemons, you can make lemonade. The beautiful thing about it is you can be broke as a joke, but if you can find a couple of dollars, you can get a couple of lemonades, a couple of lemons. And if you can take a couple of lemons, some water, some ice, and get a few cups, you can double your money on what you bought on those lemons. And eventually you're buying more lemons, and eventually buying more lemons, and eventually buying more lemons. And somewhere along the line, those few dollars that you had to buy those few lemons will now become bags of lemons, glasses of lemonade, a lemonade stand, a lemonade truck, a lemonade company, and you're wondering what happened. I just decided one day to take my last $2 and go and walk to the store and get a couple of lemons and start making lemonade. It's all about doing with what you have in the worst of conditions instead of waiting for the worst of conditions to become the best of situations. Because the worst of conditions can only become the best of situations when you actually put your effort into changing this worst situation into the best of situations. And that means that you have to be that seed planted that's willing to change all the circumstances and conditions around you by putting your best foot forward and your effort into what you're doing. Because when you do that, things do change. Listen, that's all I have. I'm not going to go any further than that. I had some more, but I'll finish that up at a later date. But I just wanted to go forward with there. We have gone beyond our time, even with the delay coming in. I still kept it to the hour time frame, and it is now officially 1 hour teaching for our Bible study. So I thank you. I thank you for coming through today. I thank you for being encouraged by what we're saying today. But I wanted to share this as I'm closing out. Don't let your reasonings for not doing it be the reason to miss a harvest. Plant, even when it doesn't look like you should be planting or look the best time to plant or the conditions to plant. Plant anyway. Let me say it again. Plant anyway. Because what you're planting is expected to reap a harvest in your life at some point. But you have to be willing to plant. So if you're willing to plant in now, you will be ready to plant when the time is right. And that's the key to what's happening here. So I thank God for you all. I appreciate you coming through tonight on our Bible study encounter. And I challenge you in the midst of all that you're doing to be encouraged by the work, be encouraged by the task and the journey that God has set up for you in the life that you're living in and the existence of who you are. Because the benefit of the life that you live is greater than the circumstances that you've ever encountered. But remember this, God is the only one that determines what's the best in the worst conditions and situations that you live in. But you have to be willing to have enough faith to know and trust in Him and be determined how to handle those situations instead of constantly giving reasoning as to why these things won't happen. If you can live out what God told you and plant in those conditions, even when the conditions are not optimal, then you will be successful in the work that you're doing, and God will be and you will be blessed by the faithfulness and obedience of doing God's will and plan instead of being subjected to the changes and failures because you hesitated when God said push on. Amen. Amen. God bless you all. I thank God for all of you on our broadcast today, Facebook Live and Periscope broadcast. I will be back tomorrow for our morning reflection at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, between 11:30 and 12 on tomorrow. So we thank God for you. God bless you as well, Elder. Thank you for chiming in and spending this time with us. We appreciate you all. Facebook Live, we appreciate you. Thank you for the comments and all the likes and things. I did see those. Periscope, thank you for the hearts. We saw those as well. Keep giving, keep living, keep loving. And we're going to continue to build on it. Remember that thing. So, and don't forget, we do have our building fund going on. We're not trying to build a new edifice. We're not trying to modify or be super fancy. We were blessed with a historic building, and there's certain things that we are limited in doing, and those things are costly. So in order for us to do the appropriate things, we have to be faithful enough to know that these things will happen. So therefore, we are walking out the faithfulness of God and making sure that what we're doing is appropriate for the building fund. So we thank God for you all in the midst of it. And we look forward to what He's going to do in your life. Amen. Amen. So you can always see that on our GoFundMe account, gofundme.com/Restore Gorsuch. That's GORSUCH. You can always see us on our website, www.detruesdale.com. Redeeming Oil is our website as well, and we thank God for you all. I'm going to get off of here, give you the rest of your evening. Enjoy it and be satisfied in that God is doing his thing. But guess what? Don't hold back your seed planting. Don't hold back your harvest time simply because to you the conditions aren't right. You never know. They may not be right to you, but they're perfect for God to do something miraculous in your life. Keep planting, keep harvesting, keep growing, keep being the best God called you to be. And more importantly, live that authentic life because it's key for all you're doing. God bless you. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it. I'm honored to have you on with us today. God bless you all. We will see you all soon. Take care.